So here we are. It's a brand new year, 2025. I don't know about you, but hasn't been the smoothest start to the new year. We haven't been in 2025 for very long, but it's already annoying me. Starting to settle down into it. Right, anyway, the book that I have read this month is this one, The 6 Wives of Henry VIII, and this is by Alison Weir. So I've read a few books about the Tudors, particularly over the last year. So this is another one in the collection. And I absolutely loved it again. I really, really enjoyed it. I don't think I found this quite as easy to read as the other two that I read, which I just absolutely seemed to fly through. This did seem a bit more of a historical book rather than just an exciting story, even though the other two were supposed to be historically accurate and everything. They weren't fiction or anything. This did feel a bit more of a book. There was so much information in it. It was really, really interesting. Lots of people and places and names and dates and seeing how it all ties together. And she did do that very well and gave a really wonderful, comprehensive sort of picture of Henry VIII's court. And I really, really loved it. I think there's so many people in this story that are just really fascinating and sort of complex characters. So obviously Henry VIII is a very, very complex character, a very strange person. In one way, a really sort of impressive person, athletic, and wants to do a good job and wants to be sort of charming and chivalrous and things like that, and is actually very capable and very good in many ways of what he's doing. But also he's got another side to him where he can be very cruel, very childish, and for all his confidence, he can actually be very bad at dealing with things head on. And he's got this bad habit throughout the book of giving in, making a promise to somebody that he'll do something or speak to somebody or try and resolve something, and then he just doesn't do it. Once that person's out of the room, he changes his mind and does what he wants to do. So it was a really, really great book. So obviously Henry VIII is famous for having his 6 wives. So there is Catherine of Aragon, who was his wife for the longest time, and she was the Spanish princess. She was actually married to his brother, first of all, when they were both sort of younger teens, and that marriage was arranged by their powerful ruling parents. However, Henry's older brother Arthur died about 4 to 6 months after they were married, and whether or not they consummated their marriage has been of extreme controversy since. So, I mean, to be honest, it seems unlikely to me that they wouldn't have consummated their marriage. Like, why wouldn't they? But, apparently they didn't. And Catherine was very, very God-fearing, and she absolutely swore that they hadn't. So, why does this even matter? Well, it matters because Henry wanted to marry his brother's widow. And according to the teachings of the Bible and the way that the Catholic Church practiced at the time, a man should not lay with his brother's wife because no good will come of it. But she was absolutely adamant that the marriage had not been consummated. And just to be on the safe side, their parents, Henry and Catherine's parents, got a special dispensation from the Pope to say that even if it had been consummated, it was okay. I think most people are aware that the Catholic Church at this time was pretty corrupt. So kings, it was all a case of sort of friendships and briberies and things like that. Anyway, so they got married. They were very happily married together. The book talks quite a lot about Catherine of Aragon because she was around for so much of the time. Talks a little bit about her time in England, how she found it when she first came here. There was a long period between Arthur dying and Catherine marrying Henry. It was a few years, And, you know, she was really in limbo at this time. And Henry VII, Henry's dad, was really not very good to her at all in terms of looking after her financial needs. And neither was her own family back in Spain. So she was, you know, this was a really very difficult time for her. She was rapidly running out of money and having to sell her possessions to pay her servants and things, which is obviously no way that a princess should be treated. So she was very happy when she did eventually marry Henry. And Henry seems to have been, you know, really taken with her, really in love with her. Even though she was 6 years older than him, you know, he really fell for her and liked this idea of sort of rescuing this sort of damsel in distress as well. However, as much as he did seem to genuinely love her, he had like proper no problem with, you know, having lots of affairs and mistresses. And this is a continuing theme throughout his life. He really likes the chase and the romance and everything like that, and then the conquest of an affair, and then he loses interest afterwards. So he would have quite long relationships with some of his mistresses because, you know, you had all that excitement and build up and this new relationship thing, and then it would fizzle out. So they Catherine and Henry only had one daughter, who later became Mary I. But you know, Catherine had a lot of pregnancies and miscarriages and stillbirths and babies who died very soon. So this was a very, you know, it was a very upsetting experience for both of them, and they both found it very trying. So as we all know, obviously Henry married again. One of the ladies that he became besotted with, who was one of Catherine of Aragon's ladies in waiting, was Anne Boleyn. And I think Anne Boleyn probably wasn't really that interested in him, so she was trying to put him off and, you know, sort of maybe be teased. She was very flirtatious, but she didn't actually want to have an affair with him. This may also be because he'd had an affair with her sister and used her and got bored of her. Whatever it was, anyway, Henry became absolutely obsessed with her, completely obsessed, to the point that he decided he should divorce his wife and marry her. And there probably was other things leading to this decision. I think he'd probably been thinking that maybe the reason they hadn't had, you know, they'd had so many problems having babies, he was thinking that maybe that was because he should never have married Catherine, because she was his brother's wife. And you see this again and again with Henry. Sometimes he can believe in something quite fervently and in quite an innocent way, that, you know, saying that he loved Catherine and he was glad he'd married her and he wished he could stay married to her, but he really believed deep down that it probably wasn't the right thing to do. Very convenient for him now that he's actually obsessed with somebody else who he wants to marry. And you see that again and again with him. He's really the master of fooling himself into believing what he needs to believe to get his own way. And certainly as he gets older, he becomes more and more furious with people who won't accept his justifications for his behaviour. So he wanted a divorce. But Catherine absolutely refused to divorce him. And I think part of the reason she was refusing to divorce him was because he was saying that basically their marriage should never have happened. It was never real. It never really meant anything. Their daughter that they did have would then be bastardized because, you know, the marriage should never have happened. And this was something she was completely unwilling to accept. And she absolutely suffered for it. She really, really did. She ended up, you know, sort of being expelled from court, pushed around into different houses, treated very badly in them, you know, very little expenses for her living. And, you know, she became ill and that sort of continued on. She was treated very badly. And I think there was a big side of Henry that sort of thought it would be really convenient if she would just, you know, die. So she was treated very badly, but she really adamantly refused. And maybe if she had you know, accepted the divorce, I think Henry probably would have been, you know, quite good to her in the way he treated her afterwards. But because she wouldn't accept it, you know, his sort of nasty side came out. Now, if only it was simple enough for Henry to have got a divorce, whether his you know, divorcee liked it or not. but he needed permission from the Pope for the divorce. And this shouldn't have been a problem. The Pope, Clement VII, was a weak Pope and probably would have been quite happy to just do whatever Henry wanted, particularly if there'd have been some benefit in it for him. But unfortunately, he wasn't in a position to do that because he was basically being held hostage by Charles V of Spain, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. And they were absolutely adamant that the Pope was not going to allow this divorce. And the Pope, really between a rock and a hard place, found it very difficult to stand up to either of these monarchs or take side completely with either of them. So he just tried to delay things and kick the can further down the road. And his real hope was that hopefully Henry would get bored of this idea. And there are actually a lot of people in Henry's court, such as Cromwell, who also sort of hoped that Henry would get bored of this. And there was a lot of them who thought that Henry and Anne, she was his mistress, and going on his cycle before, he tended to get infatuated with people and then lose interest with them. However, because they weren't actually having sex, so Anne had realised that her refusal to actually sleep with Henry is what was driving his desire ever harder and more fervently. So this actually became something she couldn't sleep with him really, because she knew then that he would lose interest in her. And by this time, she'd sort of accepted that actually she quite liked the idea of becoming queen, and she could see that it was actually a reality that could appear. So she then had to keep, pushing his desire further down the road. So this divorce proceeding thing went on literally 4 years, and the church just would not make a decision on it, the papacy. And so you had people in England were divided. Obviously Henry wanted people around him who would agree with him, like Cranmer, and Cromwell was doing what he could to try and get the divorce for Henry, because that's what he did for him. But anyway, it was just being kicked down, and this literally went on for years until in the end Henry VIII broke from the Church of Rome. And this is really massive, this step. This is the beginning of the Reformation and everything. So this was a really big step in English history, the beginning of the Church of England and Protestantism in England. However, as Alison Weir describes really well in her book, actually little would have changed for most practicing Christians in England. Henry VIII wanted to break from the rulership of the Pope and become his own master of the church, but he had no real interest in changing the way that the church ran things. So to all sort of effect, he was still a practicing Catholic. And this book actually was good. It gave a good idea of the evolving religious beliefs of the time, because these Protestant ideas and Lutheranism were coming in from overseas, and these ideas were going on, but they were actually really resisted for a long time. It was a gradual thing. It wasn't an overnight decision that now this is what we're going to do. Not as I understand it later on with the Puritans and things like that. This was much more a very, very gradual evolving of ideas with, opposition and things. So by doing this, Henry VIII then could, appoint the people he wanted to overlook his divorce and whether he should have his divorce. And unsurprisingly, they thought he should get his divorce and that he was right in that. And Catherine of Aragon never accepted it, and she died probably quite a miserable death from sort of neglect, really. Anyway, and it seems actually that Anne Boleyn was quite cruel to her and her daughter Mary, and then later on other people who she didn't like, and seemed to quite like taking revenge on people. And I mean, I'm sure she's a very complex character as well, and Yeah, she could be a bit of a bitch sometimes, though. And her relationship with Henry was always quite fiery, which may have been part of what attracted him to her as well, is the fact that she would argue with him and say no and disagree with him. However, when they actually got married, Henry decided he didn't, it was exciting and sexy when this woman said no to him, but actually when she was his wife, he didn't really like it so much. And it's kind of amazing how quickly his strong feelings for her diminish once they are married. So partly I think it was just, all the build up and then maybe a bit of an anticlimax when they were actually married and together. For all that Henry didn't want to be married to Catherine, they had actually been happy married most of the time. She let him do whatever he wanted, whereas Anne wasn't like that, and she certainly didn't like his affairs and things. And also, to top it off, when Anne got pregnant, which she did quickly, she had another girl, and they had really believed that it was going to be a boy. I think Henry had sort of fooled himself so much that it was just being married to the wrong woman that was the problem. And they were so sure that they were going to have a boy. They'd even had, the letters announcing the birth written up, announcing the birth of a boy. So he wasn't happy about that. He quickly lost interest in her. And eventually, she was beheaded for treasonous adultery. And these were probably trumped up charges, and Henry probably knew they were really, but again, he's very happy to fool himself when it suits him. And he was also interested in someone else by this point. Jane Seymour, whose family, she was ambitious, her family were ambitious, sort of advised her to try out the same tactic that Anne had used in being friendly and engaging and flirtatious with the king, but not actually succumbing. And this worked wonders. And he was completely infatuated again. And I mean, he was determined to be with Jane. And the whole downfall of Anne Boleyn is really quite, horrific, really, in the way that people turned against her, the king himself. And, she was executed. It was all quite awful. And, Henry was quite happily preparing to marry Jane very, very quickly after Anne was beheaded. Jane, it's funny, I've never really thought about her as a person before reading this book. Obviously, I know she's the one that gives him the son, then she goes and dies pretty much straight away. But it was interesting in this book finding out a bit more about her and her background and her character. She seems really quite a, polar opposite from Anne. She seems very sort of prudish and into etiquette and manners and things like that. She's also more interested in the old faith, and she wants to, reinstate Mary as an heir and slow down the changing things, the religious changes in the country. So Henry marries her. She has a son. He's absolutely over the moon, but unfortunately she dies very, very soon afterwards, probably from an infection from the childbirth. And then Henry's actually single for a short time. His next wife is Anne of Cleves. This is really a political marriage, and it's really being pushed by his sort of council around him to help with relations, to have stronger ties in Europe, to help against Spain and France, who are sort of more allied at this time. Henry is unsure about marrying somebody he's never actually met, so he sends his famous artist, Hans Holbein Jr., over to paint a picture of her, and he paints a very beautiful picture of her. However, when she arrives, Henry is not impressed with the real deal, the real thing. So it's a very strange thing. Again, Henry sort of makes this decision, and he won't be persuaded, but he won't just be honest. And so he goes ahead. He does marry her, even though he's met her. He didn't like her. So her background, she's sort of a German princess. She's quite inexperienced, very sort of green and everything. Doesn't really understand flirtation and things like that. She's also not as sort of petite and curvy as the other ladies that he's liked. But he does go ahead and marry her, and then he just complains non-stop about it and how it's impossible for him to consummate his marriage to this appallingly disgusting person, which is, you know, quite harsh really to blame everything on her. And Henry, by this age, you know, he's getting on a bit at this time, and he is getting older. This is by the time, you know, he's got his problem with his leg that makes him really miserable, because he can't get out and do the things that he wants to do, and he's eating more because that's the only activity he can really enjoy. So he's not in great shape. He's annoyed about it. But, you know, this young lady is so repulsive to him that it's impossible for him to consummate his marriage. And poor Anne, you know, she's really in the dark about it for some time. But eventually, you know, it's you know, decided that she's going to be divorced. And again, there's a really flimsy basis for it. But by now, everybody around Henry just does as they're told. You know, gone are the days when he will debate things and maybe change his mind a little bit. He's becoming more and more tyrannical as he gets older. But Anne decides to accept the divorce, and she does very, very well out of it. She's very well looked after, and she is given a sort of position in court of sort of the king's sister. So she's got a very high position in court. She never marries again. She's very well looked after. She's got property, she's got income, she's got servants, and she really likes England, and she takes to it very well. And actually, although she came over as a sort of Protestant princess, she actually ends up basically becoming a Catholic, because that was sort of more what was going. The Protestant views were really the new thing at the time. And also Henry around this time meets Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard is a lot younger than him. We don't even know exactly how young she was, but she was a teenager. And he falls madly and passionately in love with her and marries her. By now he's like nearly 50. So I did a review on the book which was all about Catherine Howard. Was it Young, Fair and Damned? Which was a brilliant book which really went into her in a lot of detail. They were only married for about 18 months because, unfortunately, she actually had an affair when she was married, but it was found out that she had sexual relations before they were married, and she'd then taken that man into her service. Now, she probably took him into her service because she was worried he was going to say something, or it's better to keep him on side than annoy him unless he upset things with the king. And she did. There was somebody in also who was in the king's service who she did really like, who she'd liked when she was a maid of honour for Anne of Cleves. That's where Henry likes to find his wives most. So she was beheaded for treasonous adultery, and it's quite sad. He probably didn't really need to go to the lengths of actually beheading her. He could have probably just divorced her for having sexual relations before they met. But I think that betrayal hurt his pride probably even more than so the whole Anne Boleyn thing. He knew that wasn't really deep down. He probably knew that wasn't really the case. Whereas with Catherine, this really was happening. It wasn't him, this wasn't being done to benefit him. This was really something he didn't want to be happening. And it really hurt his pride that his wife, was interested in other men. So then on to Henry's last wife, which is Catherine Parr. And Catherine Parr, she's really a remarkable woman, in herself. So I think she's sort of in her 30s at this point, and she's twice widowed. So she was married off as a sort of young teen to a very old man who didn't live that long. And then she was married to somebody who was still quite a bit older than her, not quite as old, and was widowed again. She actually liked Thomas Seymour quite a lot, who was Jane Seymour's brother. But by then Henry was interested in her, you see. So he sent Seymour away and then made his move on Catherine. And I think she probably tried to resist him a bit because, he's not really like a great catch at this point in terms of fancying him and things like that. He's like really obese. His leg is so bad now that a lot of the time he can hardly move. And although at times he can be a fun, flirtatious, chatty person, he can also get angry very quickly and, get angry and annoyed and things like that, particularly with the people who are closest to him. But anyway, she does marry him. And I think she genuinely, did love him, and she did a lot to try and help him in his last years, rebuild his relationships with his daughters, who he, at different times had really turned his back on. And also to just try and be there for him and comfort him as much as she could, in his last years. But she was certainly no sort of just nursemaid-y woman. She was a really highly educated woman, and she really prided herself on her knowledge. And she also liked to encourage other young women to be educated, and she did a lot to help, young Elizabeth I in her education. But she also had her, lucky escape from arrest while in the short time that she was married to Henry, because her views were much more sort of Protestant than what was accepted at this time. I mean, at this time, people were still being killed as heretics for Protestantism. So she really had to hide some of her more extreme beliefs, although she made sure she put tutors in place around, say, the young prince. So he was very, very Protestant growing up. Anyway, and then she had an interesting time after she'd been married to Henry. She did go and marry Thomas Seymour, who then had some bizarre interactions with young Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, who was living with them at the time. And Catherine got pregnant. This was her first baby she was having, from her 4 marriages. And she had a little girl, and then Catherine died soon afterwards. Probably from an infection from the childbirth. And strangely as well, Thomas Seymour died, I think less than a year afterwards as a traitor. So, there's so much death in these books. It's almost like reading a fiction for the amount of drama and everything. That's why I think it's so fascinating and enjoyable. So yeah, that's The Six Wives. Really, really, really good book. I really felt, in the Tudor world reading this book. I absolutely loved it, and I did not want it to finish at all. She portrays Henry's complex character really well, his sort of flamboyance, also his sort of love of privacy. He's a really complex character. He's not straightforward at all. He's got this sort of raging temper. He's also very sensitive. I also liked in this book a lot of the sort of details about the sort of everyday ways of life and the rules of everyday life. Just for an example, she talks about the sort of technicalities of marriage, how that would have worked at that time, pre-contracts, dowries, the ceremony, the restrictions, all that stuff's really interesting. Also interesting about the childcare, particularly the Queen's, the baby care, or the complete lack of baby care. Literally, as soon as the baby's born, it's like posted off to its own palace with its own staff. And I think it was only Anne Boleyn who really wanted to look after her own child, which, I think that was frowned upon, But it's really interesting, especially in this time of high infant mortality and their personal experience of it. You think that they would be desperate to be around their young child and protect them in every way they can, but absolutely not the beliefs of the time. Very, very good. Very interesting. Loved it. And I will definitely be looking for more books about the Tudors, and more particularly by Alison Weir. I really enjoyed that book. Okay. It was a big book though. Big old book, but it was really good. And it had pictures in it. I love the pictures in books. And you get a really nice feel for the people and who they are. Really love that. And also some really brilliant family trees at the back of the book to just help you understand how everybody's related to each other. Really, really interesting. Loved it. And the book I'm reading now is this one. It's all about astrology. This is Written in the Stars by Debbie Frank. And I have enjoyed this book lots as well. Absolutely flying through that. So I'll have a review for that soon. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you.